So
everybody.
people, if you're starting to come in, hello, hello, ayo, share out where you're calling in from. We're getting prepared, letting everyone roll into the room, and we are going to broadcast out shortly to the internets, broader internets on Facebook. So go on and chime in where you're from, everybody, while we get rolling.
Hello,
And
hello.
Hi, everybody.
Berkeley, Henderson,
we'll just run with this.
Montreal, nice.
Yeah, all right.
Representing Ireland.
Oh man, okay.
Ireland.
Let's with this guy. I'm gonna get us on Facebook. Da-da.
Argentina. Hi, Canada. Planet Earth.
Nice.
I've heard that place it has, you know, good and bad to it. It's got some good things. It's got some shadow.
Yeah.
Hello. So I'm also presently in SoCal.
Hi, Mexico.
All right. And folks who are joining in, what's happening right now is I'm just going to get us broadcasted out to the broader interwebs, and we'll get started in a moment.
Kyle, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Ido. Can everybody else hear Ido? I'm going to drop that in the chat. Maybe somebody was having... Okay, yep.
I can hear you, yes.
What?
And...
Somebody says you're quiet. Speak up, Ido. Get louder.
All right, I am going live on Facebook.
Awesome.
How about now?
Yeah, we got you. I guess
you
it's...
guys hear me, but it's still low.
Yeah, I guess it's a little low.
How
All
about
right, I believe we are live on Facebook.
We are. It says webinar is now streaming on Facebook. Hey, Facebook
Okay.
world.
Hello, Facebook world, and also hello to everybody joining us here on Zoom. And, you know, continue chiming in on the chat here where you're calling in from. You are at the Psilocybin Summit. This session is about the dark side, the shadow side of the fungus. And so my name is Mike Margulies. I'm probably best known for my work with a project called Psychedelic Seminars, which you can find at psychsems.com. That's PSYCHSEMS.com, where I produce and host events similar to Daniel. We're old friends, go back a ways. And I do other work doing community building and network building in the space. And so today's talk, we've got two awesome guys here that are going to be speaking, our main featured speakers for the subject of the shadow. So first, I'll introduce Kyle. Kyle Buller, he's a Master of Science, and he's the co-founder of Psychedelics Today, education media platform, and a weekly podcast. And he got his Bachelor of Arts in Transpersonal Psychology and his Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling with an emphasis on somatic psychology from Prescott College. And his clinical background in mental health consists of working with at-risk teenagers in crisis and with individuals experiencing an early episode of psychosis and providing counseling to undergraduate and graduate students in a university setting. Kyle's been studying breathwork since October 2010 with Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson of Dream Shadow Transpersonal Breathwork. And that is Kyle Buller. And you can find more of him on Psychedelics Today podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. It's a great program that I definitely would recommend checking out. And then we have Dr. Ido Cohen, who's a PsyD, works in SF with individuals, couples, and groups focusing on early childhood trauma, shame, addiction, relational issues, dream work, and psycho-spiritual growth. And his doctoral dissertation was research on the integration process of ayahuasca ceremonies from a Jungian perspective. Ido is also the founder of the Integration Circle, a collective of therapists and counselors passionate and dedicated in supporting individuals in preparation, integration, and education of alternative states of consciousness. So welcome both of you guys to the program, and thanks for being here. I will also add another additional note is that the two of you guys have made a course together on this exact topic. Yep. And I'm going to throw the link in the chat here on the Zoom call.
Thank you.
You can find their broader course. And I think a good place for us to start, I know you have We don't have a lot of slides, but there are a couple of them that are going to start off with what's the definition of the shadow and give us some context and foundation where we can start this conversation here together. So I'll hand it off to you. Do you have the ability to share a screen?
I
or
do.
I have to grant that? All right.
All right, present. Everybody can see this? Good? All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We titled this Dark Side of the Fungus. Feel like we should probably play some Pink Floyd here. All right, so let's just start off with a definition here by Carl Jung about the shadow. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it's embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. And so we're just gonna just provide a little bit of definitions here for the shadow to give context for this discussion. All right. So some of these definitions came from the shadow course that Ido and I put together. And oh, look, this first quote here is by Dr. Ido Cohen. Everything that is out of the light of our consciousness, everything and anything that we are unconscious of and do not have a relationship with. Current associations of negative and darkness with misrepresentation. And shadow is characterless. It's not negative or positive. It's what we are not conscious of. And I think that's a really important point to highlight, because I think sometimes we view the shadow as negative. And, you know, we were just kind of talking beforehand, before kicking off. Sometimes, you know, the shadow is protecting us at times. So yeah, I think that's an important thing. It's not negative or positive. And the shadow is parts of ourselves that have been regulated to the unconscious, the parts that cannot be tolerated consciously. These parts can range from unconscious to semi-conscious material parts that are fragmented off versus being in a more cohesive, integrative narrative. And that's by Laura Northrup. And then Dr. Joe Tafur, our own darkness, negative intentions, self-destructive behavior, hate towards self, others, and shame. Ido, you want to toss anything else in here?
No, I think these are great starters for us to build that foundation.
Awesome. And then we'll just talk about the personal, collective, and golden shadow. Ido, I'll let you take a little bit of this one.
So I think that, we put this one together just to give a few examples. So I think, right, for the personal, it's parts of yourself that you're not conscious of or prefer to not be conscious of or be in relationship with. So, right, we all have painful memories, painful experiences, either with family members or society or stuff that happened to us that we either prefer not to think about or to feel because it's just too painful. And just stuff that we're just not conscious of just yet. And it's kind of lurking in the shade, as we said before. I give you some of these aspects as neglected parts of ourselves and unconscious defense mechanism. So really the idea of these are parts of us that go into hiding. I like to think about it as parts of us that go into hiding and protection because of the amount of pain that they experience. So I think it's interesting to think about the shadow as an attempt to protect parts of ourselves and also protect our body and our psyche and our nervous system from potential overbearing pain or too painful or something that's overwhelming. So it can be unconscious shadowed stuff we don't know, or memories, childhood memories, traumatic experiences. Traumatic experiences can be, and we'll soon touch on it, can be also collective, like a war, or an earthquake, or fires, or racism, right? So on and so forth, which is very, very real in our life for all of us right now. Mm-hmm. Then we have the collective. So, right, what are unspoken and neglected parts of society? So like, for example, which kind of systems do we have in place that sustain power and oppression versus equality and empowerment? And I know we're going to go into that later, so I don't want to foreshadow that. This has been, for a lot of us, I think 2020 is the year of shadow. You can run, but you cannot hide. there's really nowhere to go right now, then kind of being really constantly being mirrored about ourselves and what's happening collectively. And I think what's important, at least for me, is to highlight how it's, I think a lot of what we've heard and I hear is that as painful as it is, it also feels like there is a potential or an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's already an interplay between shadow and potential for change. So examples, right? George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, racism, COVID, right? Which exposed a whole bunch of aspects of healthcare, politics, and the dark side of capitalism, climate change, right? Which is a big thing, especially if you're living in anywhere in the West Coast in the US, but it's all over the world. Climate change is really stepping up to the front of the conversation now. And it's another shadow, it's another collective shadow. We don't spend enough time talking about climate change. And one thing that we would like to kind of bring is that the idea that there is a golden shadow. So when we push away our negative aspects, personal or collective, we're also pushing away their other side, which is their positive side, their golden side, right? So it can be anything from playfulness, sexuality, creativity, humor, joy, compassion, beauty, connection to nature, connection to spirit, right? So if right, the best example is if I was really, really traumatized, hurt when I was a little child, I will push away that child. I also push away the positive qualities of that child. So it means that I can push away that child's curiosity, that child's play, that child's innocence, and all that stuff. So it's really important to say that there is a shadow and a golden shadow. They work together. And obviously, psilocybin and psychedelics open us up to our personal and collective shadow, and also show us our golden shadow, I think, which can be sometimes as overwhelming as our negative shadow. So all these stuff that we'll get into.
Yeah, I really appreciate the golden shadow. That was something that I was thankful we jumped into in our series, and I think you said sometimes it's almost harder to go into that than some of the the quote unquote like darker shadow aspects, because maybe that's like actually sometimes really comforting, and those kind of defense mechanisms that make us feel safe. Whereas like sometimes that golden shadow is like, ooh, like if you haven't. You feel guilty for feeling happy at times and expressing maybe, that playfulness. And then it's like, ooh, that actually is my growth, like that edge to play with. So awesome. Well, this is it for the slides. So we're just going to open it up for more of a conversation.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you guys for building that context there. There's a lot of different things I want to dig in further from all of that. I think maybe first what I'd love to do is ground this more in something more personal, if that's all right with you guys. And, as oftentimes this is, I think, an instance of a shadow of the community. There is this idea of people not speaking to their own personal experiences, and that, the experts are not supposed to do that. And there's we can go into that aspect of the shadow too within our own community. But in counter to that, I would love to lean into that some more, and I'd love to ask each of you guys on a personal level, what has been your relationship to the shadow? What have you encountered in your psychedelic experiences, and what have you learned?
I love that you're I guess I'll start off. I think I'll discuss the first time, because this is the Psilocybin Summit. So I'll chat about a really difficult time that I had with my first psilocybin experience when I was 19. I was dealing with a lot of shadow material already. I was really struggling with integrating a near-death experience that I had when I was 16. I was dealing with a lot of existential angst and a lot of depression and a lot of kind of like suicidal ideation. And that suicidal ideation was really kind of oriented towards this feeling of going home that I felt when I was dying. I was laying in a CAT scan machine. I ruptured my spleen and had internal bleeding, and I felt like I was, going home. There's a sense of going back somewhere. And so I think after that experience, I was always kind of yearning to get to that feeling again. And it wasn't until about like 3 years later, I stumbled across psilocybin. And I went into it not with any intention. I wanted to escape because of this like really difficult mindset I was in. And you know, I started to confront a lot of this material, and it started to get really, really scary. And some of that material, I know Simon might have covered this when he was going through his presentation, talking about the personal shadow. And I know he made a comment about like being eaten or torn apart. And that was like an example that he had of confronting the shadow. And that's really what happened. I started to confront a lot of these dark, negative emotions and feelings, and the world started to become very scary. Everything started to have teeth and you know, mouths, and I really didn't know what to do then. I remember just sitting, I was in the woods just trying to manage and ground it all, and I thought I was dying. And so I was really confronting with a lot of dark material, and confronting death. Like it felt like death was starting to creep in, but as I started to go into it, there was something intuitively that spoke to me and said, you know, just relax into this experience and learn from it. And that's exactly what I did. And it ended up turning into a really beautiful experience and really helped me kind of contextualize this trauma that I was working through. But I would say that, I mean, that was probably a very, very dark shadow experience, you know, dealing with like being eaten. And, you know, I didn't know about this back then, but just thinking about kind of like the shamanic illness initiation, you know, there is some of that narrative where, you know, you get torn apart and then kind of rebuilt back together again. The spirits come in and chew you into pieces. And so, yeah, you know, that was, I guess, really my first confrontation with the shadow in a psychedelic experience at 19. And I didn't know anything about this. And I remember just being like, what the hell was that? But on the flip side, being able to go through that, I was really able to move through a lot of trauma and stuff I was holding on to, and really find healing from that experience. And that's part of the experience that got me here on this path, wanting to became so interested in what the hell is going on here, these substances.
Okay, that's powerful. I always share this story. This was my first ever time sitting in an ayahuasca ceremony many years ago in a country far away from here. I came really like, I had some experiences before, but I came very curious and eager, and it was like a culmination of a dream come true for me. It was something that I've been reading about and curious, and I had the opportunity to do it within like an shamanic indigenous context, like really Shipibo style in Peru, and I remember sitting there and drinking, and then, you know, everything, they turn off all the lights, and then I just started feeling this intense fear, and I started going through what I think a lot of people go through in the first times, which is, why the hell am I doing this to myself? What am I doing here? And I was like, okay, you know, just do what you know, breathe and stay in it. And after, and I could, as the shaman started singing, I could start feeling something crawling inside my whole body. And I was like, what? And it felt dark and scary, and I couldn't understand it with my own paranoia, but I put this whole dark shade on the experience. And I just went into full on panic mode. And I remember feeling this entity like working inside of me, and I had no idea what it's doing. But I was so scared that I was trying to evoke every thought, concept, spiritual idea, person I know, anything to grasp for safety. And anything I touched just melted like Dali's like clocks. Every thought, every ideal, everything I tried to like hang on to just whoop, melted away. And it felt like I was free falling, just free falling in existence. And then I heard this voice saying like, okay, you're not ready to let go. What do you want to keep on? What do you want to hold on to? And I was like, my sanity. Just let me hold on to my sanity. Not even knowing what I meant. And then that moment, the whole thing transformed, and I was standing inside a room with whoever saw The Matrix, the second movie, where he stands with the creator and he's looking at all these screens that are all parts of him. That's, and just this cacophony of feelings and sensations and all these things that are myself. And in that moment, I was like, oh my God, that's me. In some deep part of my psyche, this is how I experience my life. This is how I experience living. And then I got sucked into this vacuum darkness that felt utter blissful. There was just this silent, soft bliss. And I could feel someone like supporting me from my back. It's like, you feel this? And then pushing me back into the cacophony. In and out, and in and out, and in and out for who knows how long. And it was just this really, really humbling experience of like, oh, this is who I actually am deep inside. Not who I want to, not my projection of myself, but this is the totality of me. And I have a lot of freaking work to do. There's a lot of freaking work for me to do inside. And that was my entrance into that ayahuasca world. So that was kind of, Kyle and I talk about moving from ego death to ego disidentification. That's what that felt for me. Years later, I understood that's what it felt. It's like, oh, this is what it feels like when I'm not in my projection of myself. So that's a shadow example.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. Thank you both for sharing so openly and vulnerably about your personal experiences. I think it's very important and underrated. And I'd love to offer some reflections actually on the themes that came up just now, right? I mean, and a lot of this comes to what you were sharing before about the relationship to the shadow. And in the one hand, you can, sort of, Kyle, you had that intuition to just sort of let go, right, and lean into the experience. And that's kind of the conventional wisdom, right? The trust, let go, be open, submit. These are the things that we hear, but are also often very hard in the moment to actually do, especially when the scariest possible things come up. And then sometimes you have the reaction like you did, Ido, and I've had this reaction too when I've been in a psychedelic experience and all the paranoid thoughts come up. There's a resistance, right? And then what happens, right? It just doesn't, it gets worse and worse. And Bill Richards has an interesting way of putting it, right? If you run away from the monster chases you. And you have to really face the monster. You have to look the monster right in the eye and say, well, what have you to teach me? And it's like you were getting to, Ido, right? Like the recognizing that aspect of yourself. And this, I think this is almost really the crux of it, right? Is the relationship to the shadow. Are we, are we identifying it as something other to be afraid of, or are we identifying it as something of ourselves? And of course, there's broader implications to this as well, and how we show up in the world. And we were talking before the call about the difference between, but in English we have these different words for shadow and shade, but in other languages these aren't actually different words. And what's the difference between shadow and shade, right? All shades are shadows, but not all shadows are shades. And when does a shadow become a shade? But it's when you're in right relation, right? When the shadow actually becomes a protective thing. And I'd love to hear you guys reflect on sort of these riffs a little bit, whatever's coming up for you here.
Yeah, it's interesting when you brought that up about shade, kind of being protective and kind of correlating it to shadow. I mean, I guess I kind of touched on that and thinking about that. Yeah, like when things get like too intense, to be like if the sun's just getting too intense, it's nice to get shade, right? It has this protecting mechanism to maybe hide out there. And I think that's the same true with the shadow, right? Like when things, if we look at something like trauma, for example, or we look at like, early childhood trauma and some of these defense mechanisms that we are actually using for our survival. And then they just become so habitual and they become like who we are. And, at what point does it then go from protecting you and just actual survival? And, these are okay to be able to act that way, to then it starts to actually have a negative impact on your life. And how do you then start to confront that? But to just say that like the shadow is always negative and it always needs to be scary, I think it is important to really value that these do have mechanisms of protection. I mean, especially when you're thinking about some stuff that happened in your life and you needed to maybe act that way, right? And like, I'm just thinking like one shadow aspect is anger and aggression. And I know that's like really hard to embody at times. But, you know, maybe if you were really kind of growing up in an environment where that meant survival, well, yeah, then that's a good thing.
You know, someone referenced in the question in the chat, I saw Donald Kalshed's book, Trauma in the Soul, which I cannot recommend enough. And he talks there about how, excuse me, he takes from the Jungian approach that basically our psyche always strives to go to develop, always strives to integrate. And that any serious interruption, which could look many, many ways, personal or collective, what it does is that it splinters off trauma in the soul. It splinters off parts of our psyche into hiding. Why? Because that part realized that to be alive can be dangerous. It get interpreted as like an attack on survival. So it goes into hiding. So that creates our shadow. And that can be both a beautiful part, like maybe I was a child who used to paint, and then one day my parent comes in and unleashes rage on me, and I associated it with painting. So painting goes into the shadow, right? And what happens is that the moment things get stuck in the shadow, they start coming out as symptoms, right? Which I think is really interesting for us, thinking about how popular microdosing is, right? So the idea from the Jungian perspective is anything that we keep in the shadow will start sending symptoms to consciousness to ask for like attention, right? And then the idea is that we have to do like some kind of process with, in Shipibo, they call it susto, right? It's soul retrieval. So we have to go back in deep into the shadow and retrieve these parts, integration, right? That's the integration piece. And and obviously that's a long process, but I like where you started us, Mike, which is how do we build a healthy relationship with our shadow? And healthy means, right, any kind of attempt to try and build an ongoing relationship where I can start looking. And hopefully, like what starts as a monster becomes much, much different. Something that I can relate to, that is digestible, that is relatable.
Yeah, and for me, I think about those paranoid experiences. That's a mode of my own psyche, right? That it actually is valuable. You don't want that to not be there. There's uses for that, but it's when it becomes, of course, when you're triggered in a time when it's not necessary is where it becomes problematic, right? But yeah, it's a lot of it's about our relationship to that unconscious, material. And I mean, there's a lot of implications here for a lot of what we're seeing, in the collective, right? So individually we experience this, but of course then collectively we experience this, and they play off of each other. So all of those things that we as individuals are experiencing as fears that we're projecting out onto others, now that and that's happening, everyone's bouncing off of each other, and we end up in a whole bunch of messes because of it, right? And certainly right now we are in a massive moment of collective shadow. We're all going through something right now. There's COVID here in California. There's wildfires. We of course have this ongoing systemic racism, and now like a growing tension that has been gathering in the country since those protests began, and there's a lot of uncertainty now on what's going to happen, and it seems like here in the United States the tension's growing, right? And each side of there's almost like two different views of reality right now, and each has different fears, and that's escalating. So I'd love to hear reflections on that, and how do we collectively get in right relationship with our shadows?
I think, if we think about the collective as a person, right? So we can say that right now this person is having all their shadow exposed by choice or by no choice. And, the three of us talked a couple of days ago when we were talking about this, and I brought up the idea of loss. Like, what do you have to lose by changing? And I think that's what we need to ask on a collective level. Like, what do we have to lose by rewiring our collective systems. And there's a lot of loss. There is a lot to lose. There's a lot of power on the line. There's a lot of money on the line. There's a lot of a sense of equality that serves a very small fragment of society and is unserving and oppressing to most of the other. And that small fragment doesn't want to change. They don't want to lose. And I think, if we're talking as far as what is our personal part, one thing that I've heard in the last 6 months from people who have been doing psilocybin actually is that they're experiencing mounts and mounts of grief. And so I think our part of the collective is that we don't know how to grieve as a collective because we don't want to lose. And grief is true. It's really when you accept your loss. Right? So how do we, and it's funny because we go into these experiences and again, it's interesting that that's coming through the mushrooms right now. And mushrooms are saying in a way, like we need to grieve. Grieve is the way to be healthy right now. And how do we interpret, right? For me, that's like when the personal becomes the teacher of the collective in integration. How do we transmit those personal experiences to our collectives?
Yep.
Starting with my family, with my medicine community, with my whoever community, and from that. And as long as we will not accept the loss that comes and we don't learn how to grieve, we don't integrate that to the bigger collective, how can we change?
Yeah, I love that you brought up the grief because that was the first thing that really kind of came to my head when you asked that question, Mike. It's like, yeah, collectively, I think like our relationship to death and grief is just like kind of out of balance, and it's kind of maybe what's got us here at times. And I just saw somebody mention in the chat here, Catherine, the theme is breath, and I was just talking to somebody yesterday about that. It's like, yeah, it seems like the theme is breath with, George Floyd, get off my neck, I can't breathe, to the smoke, the wildfires. I mean, and when we look at like something like Chinese medicine, the lungs, is grief. I remember I had this acupuncture session one time, and this was years ago, and they were like, oh, your lungs are flaring up. What are you grieving about? And I said, I don't know. I don't think anything. And as soon as I pulled that needle out, it was just like a waterfall of tears. But something that comes to mind when I think of grief, there's a book that I really enjoyed by this guy, Martin Prachtel, who's a Mayan shaman, and it's called The Smell of Rain on Dust, about grief and praise, and really how to praise life and also grieve for it. And he said, like in the Mayan village that he became a shaman in, he's like, in our culture, we would just like sit there and cry and just totally let go, total catharsis, right? And, I think this is a perfect example of like where we're at as a culture. One of his students really tried to embody this and went to a funeral for a parent or somebody in the family. The book is called The Smell of Rain on Dust by Martin Prachtel. And so he he grew up on a Pueblo Indian reserve and then found himself down in Guatemala. And there's a really great YouTube series on grief and praise there. I think somebody just put in there. But he shares this story of a student trying to embody this grief practice, just totally losing their shit at a funeral, tears, sobbing, screaming. And somebody in the family ended up calling 911 because they thought they were losing it, and ended up becoming hospitalized or given medication. And I think, what happens when we do grieve that hard? I think sometimes our culture can't contain it because, this kind of goes into some of my other work. It's like that sometimes looks like psychosis or mania, right? When you are grieving so hard for the loss of something, or you're praising life so much. I love this so much. And, it starts to look like pathology, psychopathology, and it's like, how are we like also suppressing our emotions? And it's really kind of building up. And, I think that's where some of these plant medicines come into play at times, where we're able to allow ourselves to find a community or find a space to actually let it out. We feel safe enough to let it out. The one thing that we always kind of talked about in breath work, which I liked, or maybe I just made this up, I was like, this feels like a safe place where I can act my neuroses out and be okay. And the community's there to support me. And, you know, I'm not going to look that crazy, even though I'm sitting there screaming, punching a pillow and crying.
I mean, that's like, let's look at, right? I think if we go back to, right, the idea that in like Ibogaine tradition, in Mazatec tradition, you do it in the community. So whatever neurotic part of you, whatever numinous part of you or spiritual like experience, you do it in front of everybody, and everybody is supporting you, right? Which is so different than what we are, how we are extracting and like replicating this into Western like into the Western model. One-on-one in a room, which can be really, really good and fruitful for some, right? But what about the communal aspect? What happens when I go out of that room and come back to my community with my experience of my neurosis and what I discovered about it and the world and my grief and my sadness and my beauty and my power and all that?
Yeah, all of this. Like, I mean, I had this experience at the beginning of COVID, speaking up to the grief angle here, where it was the moment when I accepted, oh shit, this is real. All of my plans for 2020, they're out the window. There was a moment sometime in March where it really hit me, and I grieved, and that was helpful to move forward and to be able to approach the moment in the right way for what the moment called for. And you know, I guess I wonder, grief is attached to acceptance, and what if we don't accept yet a circumstance because we still believe that there's something that we can change? What if there's something we can do about the scenarios we're finding ourselves in? Is that something that is inhibiting the grief process? And how do we encounter grief if we haven't really, if we don't have to say accept the loss quite yet of something, if we can still do something? And that's one question. Another one too is just I also want to reflect on what you were saying, Ido, about this and it's maybe related, but this whole collective, we have this very individuated. This is as part of our own collective shadow, is that we have this very separate self part of our culture. We're super individuated, and that shows up also in our medicalization of psychedelics. And we have and as we alluded to earlier, we have this medicalization of psychedelics where providers, it's even taboo for providers to talk about their own experiences with the psychedelic because of this, what I would say, frame as a very bizarre model, a highly sterilized model where somehow it's not just like given that your psychedelic guide has done psychedelics. So those are a lot of more thoughts to riff on here. And then, we have another, say 7 minutes or so before we go to questions, but yeah, I'll have to know what you guys think about, how do we deal with grief when we haven't accepted things, and what do we do about this whole collective issue of not seeing ourselves as a collective.
I love that you brought acceptance, and I'm curious to know what Kyle has to say about it, but I think that's one of the key and first gates to any change, let alone integration on any level. I mean, right, that's from my experience, that's where most of us fall in a post-experience. We stop accepting, we stop relating, and then we go back to what we know for that sense of familiar control, personal and systemic, right? Because what happens when you accept something, right, your psyche has to change. If I accept new information, it means that what I knew is changing, and now it's something different, right? And usually that means that my old version has to switch around for something. Has to accept something new, has to take on a new practice, has to let go of something, right? That's what we're talking. It's basically the shadow of culture in itself. It's like an anti-loss mechanism. I always like, when I do preparation with people, I'm saying, listen, you can't go and have an experience and expect to say the same. I mean, that doesn't work, right? You have to, right? So when we prepare, we talk like, are you ready for change? Which is acceptance, which is loss, which is grief, which is also all that beauty. And I think as far as psilocybin is considered, right, we have a lot of questions to ask on a collective level, like, Are we ready for this change, for the fact that we took a shamanic indigenous tradition, brought it to the US, to the world, for the most part, stripped it away from its indigenous roots and spirituality. And now we're talking about, oh, let's use it. Let's use it instead of pills. Like, are we ready for that? Do we have everything set in place? Are we asking the right questions? Like, how's that going to work with capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, these are really great questions. And something that just popped in my head, Ido, when you're talking about acceptance, and I think about like the collective shadow and integration. Dimitri Mujanis and somebody else that he was working with, they would host these integration circles, but they talked about disintegration, I think. And so I think this brings up some fundamental questions about integration and change and acceptance. Is that you have a really profound experience with psilocybin or some sort of plant medicine, and you get a new narrative, a new way of seeing the world. But you come back and everybody says, well, you have to integrate the experience and come back to the community. Well, what happens when the community is still perpetuating violence and doing really harmful things, and it's not a really, we start seeing these shadow aspects of the collective. So do you just kind of put what you saw away and say, okay, I guess I just need to go back to whatever kind of culture I'm living in, or do you actually try to change and do something else? And maybe start to embody that new way of seeing. And I think like that is one of the challenges around trying to integrate plant medicine, is that sometimes we get exposed to totally new models and new cosmologies. And then we come back and go, well, we have to really live within a capitalistic society, and we need to do this and need to do that, and we need to charge for this. And well, we just need to keep extracting from this. And it's just like, whoa. And, you even kind of bring up the medical model, and it's like, does part of the medical model need to change? Does psychotherapy need to change? We're starting to see that we're hitting walls with certain parts, and but you have these gatekeepers, and they say, well, you can't do that, and then you're just like, well, what the fuck? Maybe we can, and maybe this is the shadow that we're starting to confront and say we need to change. Things are getting really like we're at a tipping point at times, and so that's something that I really think about at times too, where it's like, do we just integrate back into a society that is perpetuating harm, violence, and oppression, and this and that, and saying, well, this is just the way it is? I don't know. I'd like to see a new way forward.
That's part of why I appreciate and love Kyle so much. I love this because, right, we're building the systems for the psychedelic science right now. Not in a year from now, not 2 years from now, right now. Right? And we talked about, like, are we really asking the questions, like, are we repeating the same mistakes of the 60s, where we're pushing for, like, use and legalization, and now we're making sure, like, wait, is everybody safe along the way? Are we doing this right? Are we honoring indigenous voices and shamanic traditions that we took this away from them? Are we, right, weaving spirituality into the Western model? Really, and I want to pose it as a question for all of us as a community. Like, are doctors who have never had a psychedelic experience or had a handful and don't know what it means to work with trauma or have any exposure to spirituality, are they qualified to give this? Are therapists who don't have this qualified? And right, the big question, for at least that we talk a lot about, Kyle and I, Mike, is how do we bring the fine-tech world into that conversation, where the ideal is scalability, growth, numbers, not results, self-care, healing. And that we have to bring that together, right? This is our opportunity. I shared with Kyle, there's this great, and I know we need to pause, but there is a great show now on Netflix with the dude, and it's called We Are Living in Future's Past, and future is a person. And I like that because I think it's like, yeah, we can do now the things that our future, that entity, will build that entity. Like right now, why do we have to wait?
Yeah. And Yeah, no, I wanted to go to questions soon, but we hit on a really important topic that I want to put a little more time into, which is, the biggest shadow of all, which is our whole exploitive economic system. And it's been in the last couple of years, as it's entered the psychedelic space. Some of us have been surprised, and maybe we shouldn't have been, right? The idea that, well, we've had this psychedelic experiences, maybe shouldn't we be able to do something better? But, as Stan Groff says, psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers, right? So that applies on the collective level. So all of the issues that happen in the broader community are happening in the psychedelic community and amplified. So all of the problems of exploitive capitalism that we see in the broader community are showing up in the psychedelic community. And it's a very, very big shadow. And we're trying to integrate psychedelics into this system that is fundamentally exploitive and fundamentally, and it's like, we're talking about trying to cure depression by scaling psilocybin, using the exploitive economic models that create the wealth disparity, that create the depression that's so widespread in the first place. So it's like the problem and the solution in the same nifty package. It's completely bonkers, right? It's sort of like when Michael Pollan talks about they created white bread, and then they took all the nutrients out, right? But then they made nutrient-enriched white bread, and that's what we're doing when we're with psychedelics being commodified right now. It's astounding to me, and there's all this money entering into the psychedelic community, which potentially has the power to do so much good, right? The problem, as I see it, though, is the money, that energy entering into the community now isn't asking the question of, hey, how do I serve? How do I create value? Yep. It's asking the question of, well, how do I plant my flag down? How do I get mine? And that's the question almost all of the big money entering the space right now, aside from the philanthropy, which has also been a major part of this community, and I don't want to forget about that, but a lot of the money that's entering now from the investor community is first and foremost, and maybe they will, of course, they want to sleep good at night. They want to think they're doing good, and there's narratives, and sure, we can acknowledge there's some good there. But the primary interest seems to me to be not value creation, but wealth extraction. And those are different things. And that's the fundamental thing that, the fundamental shadow of the community right now, in our psychedelic community and at large.
And there's a really interesting shadowy conversation there, right, about the leaders in psychedelic science world and how are they going to collaborate or not with those people who lead the fine tech world who's coming. Because you're right? Like let's put it on the table, which you are. Money is one of the biggest shadowy archetypes of our time and will ever be. It's directly linked, right, to power. It's directly linked to influence and all the things that we really want because we want to feel good about ourselves, and we think that's the way to get to have a good life, which is, right, on a whole, the shadow of Western culture, right? We talked about hyper-individualism. That's exactly it, right? So how do we bring the people who do make these decisions, who have the tools, the money, the power to create, like Kyle, you said, like to actually create bread that actually, we don't have to create bread we already know how it tasted. Let's create new bread. Right? But how do we have that integrity right now and not wait like what happened in the 60s after a few people die and things start coming around, right? And cultures like there's abuse and sexual abuse that's hidden and all that. And then everybody's like, oh, okay, now we have to deal with it. Like, why? Do we need all those casualties?
Yeah, this is such a complex topic, I feel like, and Joe and I definitely get into a lot of this on our podcast. And, I think one of the other sides to all this, it's like, I think a lot of us got into this, like, I mean, I definitely got into it through personal experiences, but then maps and said, what if this is available to everybody? And so, when we think about, some of these strategies to scale, it's like, okay, like if psychotherapists and we were able to have these healing modalities available, I mean, being able to scale that sounds good, but I think what we're coming back to is integrity, and are we honoring the lineage of where they're coming from? I mean, MAPS definitely wouldn't be doing, most of the research that they're doing without huge amounts of donation. I mean, clinical research is very expensive, and to see some of these new players come in that were able to kind of build capital, it's like, oh, that's awesome, because maybe they're able to fund new research. But it's like, I think the thing that I see is a lot of people are just like switching and seeing this as a gold rush, and maybe they have no experience, nothing, no lineage here, and they see this of going, oh, we can make a lot of money here, or maybe they don't understand some of the weird transpersonal. I mean, I bring this up all the time with Joe. It's like, do we really know what we're doing here if we bring psychedelics on a mass scale with the weird transpersonal spiritual emergencies that can emerge? And what type of casualties are going to happen if we approach this with not a lot of respect? And you have a company, and Mike, I know you brought this up at Horizons, who's planning on training a bunch of therapists without any sessions and maybe not really knowing how to hold space. And that's one of my areas, is focusing on spiritual emergencies. And I've chatted with lots of clients and stuff like that in the past that have had really horrifying experiences, not being held, not being contained, and it's really traumatized them. And I think we have to be really honest about that as well. I think we really have to approach these medicines with respect. And Mike, as you said, non-specific amplifiers. Charles Manson happened. A lot of bad can happen if you amplify that within the psyche and not really confronting it. So I know we probably have to wrap.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we actually have touched on some of the questions were about economics and Charles Manson, so we have hit on them. And I guess one more point I want to make too is that as far as this psychedelic therapist being trained without actually having the opportunity to do psychedelics, and some, of course, we can assume have had their experiences, maybe not officially, but to have that not be a fundamental part of the training. The fact that there will be psychedelic therapists who haven't done it, to me, is astounding. And this is yet another reflection of our own community's shadow, right? How many times have you seen a researcher on a documentary, the first thing they say every time, almost bar none, is, well, we're not Timothy Leary. And there's always this we're not the 60s. And there's this shadow we have, and it's we have this shame or something around our relationship to the origin of in the Western culture of emergence in the 60s of psychedelics. We have this shame around how it happened, and that's a shadow. We have this sort of Timothy Leary shadow, this projected image of who he was that's somehow a shadow on us, and we don't want to be that. And somehow that shadow is informing us in ways that we're actually making, I would say, bad decisions. And that's a problematic shadow. Why are we not talking about this more? I'll give you guys the choice. You can field that, or I can ask a question from the audience.
Take it.
All right. The one I like here is from Sheila, is how can the collective shadow be worked through with psychedelics? I understand on a personal level, but what might that look like collectively?
So straight off the bat, right? So I think it's really, first of all, asking yourself, how have societal systems impacted me, right? So standards of beauty, standards of what right or wrong, what a woman should be, what a man should be, what anyone should be. How was that impacted through my environment, where I grew up, the country I grew up in, the school I grew up in, the family system, the religion, right? I mean, that's just for us asking the question of country. There's intergenerational trauma. You're already opening the door for that. I mean, I can share a story of being in a ceremony once and meeting someone that I never met, and in the first 5 minutes we recognized that she's Palestinian and I'm Israeli, and we had this really tense moment of okay, and it came through for both of us in that night, and we both had an experience. Of having this really deep message about our land. And we both got this message of, this is not your land or your land, you're both renting. So being shown how that's the problem. This is what happens when you wrapped up in power. So right, for both of us, it opened up this really big collective of religion and politics and land and country. So I think for me, the question, I love that question. And it's really asking yourself first, how have I been influenced by the collective unconscious, right? I think the big one now that we can ask is about climate change and racism. Where am I in the race conversation? And really being honest with yourself. Where am I on the climate change conversation? What do I do? How do I contribute? How do I not contribute? So I think starting there, and then once you find really distill it to things that are that you can name, that you can put in a sentence or a paragraph, you weave it into your intention. You go with that into your intention. It's like, okay, I want to open myself up to that. My only caveat would be that if you're opening yourself up to the collective unconscious, do it respectfully, be humble, and yeah, have your tools ready. Because it's a lot of energy. It's a lot of archetypal energy to come through your body and your psyche.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just echo what you said, like, and also just starting with yourself. Something that I come back to is something that a teacher told me, and he said he took it from Bucky Fuller. I've never been able to find the quote, but he said, we're really here to make small local adjustments. And I think sometimes when we're confronted with a lot of this stuff, we really want to shake the system like immediately, and then maybe we feel hopeless and helpless that like, wow, there's all these like cultural shadowy things that I want to work at, but how do I even start? Right. And so kind of coming back to like this integration idea, it's like, how do we just start making small local adjustments? How do I start with myself? And then maybe how do I change that within my smaller family systems and then communities, right? And if we could all just start there and hopefully have a ripple effect, that's the way I would think about how do we deal with this stuff on a collective level? What can you do in your life that would have an impact? Like, what do you believe in? If you believe in, say, climate change, like what are you doing in your local life to maybe help combat that, right? And those are hard things to sit with, right? Like I was just talking to somebody, I was like, this is the longest time I think I've gone without traveling, like either getting in my car and going on a long road trip or getting on a plane. And it's been really interesting to kind of stay put for the past few months and not like, just be like, okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there. And, that's also been really agitating to me and be like, but then I think about like the global warming aspect or climate change. I go, well, maybe this is a part that I can do right now is just kind of slow down on traveling and burning carbon.
Yeah. I'll quickly field this question myself as well. I actually wrote about this topic on Double Blind. I just sent the link, a premise I called PEACH, which stands for Psychedelic Education and Community Healing. And the whole premise of this article is that we're not going to solve most of our problems by this, giving people psilocybin in isolation as though they are just, you're an individual completely in a vacuum from the rest of society, and your depression is just some disease that exists in a vacuum, because that's not what's happening now. There is a collective, and so what is it? It's the things you guys were talking about earlier, right? Like, let's go back maybe to communal ceremonies. Maybe this. I mean, there is a time and place for sure for individual healing and these community healing and communities for integration. It's integration circles, right? There's an example right there. These are all, I think, examples of community healing, and I think also it's asking that question too. I mean, we need to start. We can use psilocybin not to just say, oh, how am I going to cure my depression? But, hey, asking ourselves these questions of, wait, how do we deal with these structural systemic issues? We have to just start asking that question with the psychedelics. And that's how well maybe we can do it. And maybe
I love that you said that, because I think that's what, for me, makes psychedelics really interesting, is that when you really dive into your personal depression, it always ties to some system. Unless it's like a biochemical, like something you're born with. For me, it always gets tied to some system, either your family or your partner or your community where you grew up in, or your ethnicity or your race, or how you're raised, what it's been through. And right, so there is always that question of always that bridging question that Kyle was presenting. Okay, so now you reveal that. What are you going to do with that? Move beyond to the transpersonal, beyond your personal self. Say, Mike, do we have time for that last question?
Which one are you calling the last question?
The microdosing question?
Yeah, and Daniel, chime in here if we can go up or off. We have to cut off. But the last question was, can you speak more how microdosing may help us get in touch with our personal shadow in small doses? It seems this could be a way to teach people how to feel their shadow via baby steps, which could then make it easier to face the totality of their shadow in bigger trips.
Kyle, you want to start?
I was going to say, I'll let you do that. You seemed excited about it.
I am excited about it. I love whoever, Matt. I totally agree. I work with a bunch of people who are microdosing on a regular basis. And it does, what I found is that it soothes the nervous system enough for the deeper material to come up. So, right, so it can really like ease your anxiety or depression, but what it does is opens up access to that shadow. So for me, that's why I love microdosing when it's incorporated with some kind of support from someone else, right? And both for the shadow, for the negative shadow and positive shadow, because what I observed a lot with people who microdose is that all of a sudden they start feeling like I'm working with someone who's been very, very anxious for the majority of their life. And they have been microdosing for the last 2 years, and all of a sudden they feel ease. So their job is to integrate ease. Right? So no negative shadow, but golden shadow. Their job is to like, oh wow, I can just sit here and relax and read a book, and I'm not as insecure as I thought I was, and I'm not just that stress ball that I lived for 30 years in that body with. So I love that comment and the idea that yes, but I guess I'm advocating for if you're microdosing, make sure there's someone you go to that can help you like digest the deeper material that comes up, and not just make it. Or you can just use it for symptom relief, which is totally fine.
Yeah, I was going to echo that. I know we got to go, but I was just going to say, yeah, like if you are microdosing, could you even have a practice to help you deal with anything that could be emerging, like, either somatic processing and just maybe learning some skills to be able to process information and create a practice around that. So you are dealing with whatever that's coming up. Yeah, yoga is great. Mike, I'll let you take it.
Yeah, no, and I'll add one more thing. There's also the threshold dose. There's also the small dose. It's not just, the smallest sub-perceptual amount or the mystical experience. There's actually a whole range. So you can also do an experience that's like a small dose, where you're definitely experiencing something, but you're not necessarily kind of just, you don't have to blast out all the way. So I think we do have to wrap. That's the signal that we have gotten from our fearless leader, Daniel. However, if folks want to continue the conversation, TAM Integration has a Discord server. Do you guys want to go on the Discord for a minute and field questions there?
Sure.
We'll be on the TAM Integration Discord server. And Daniel, maybe you can throw the link to that on the chat here. I don't have it handy here. I believe you should find it on your materials for the conference as well, or on the TAM Integration website. I want to thank you both for joining tonight, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you everybody.
And thank you, Daniel.
And thank you to Daniel for having us here to have this really important talk. This was great, and this is a conversation that we will continue individually and collectively.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to pitch, if you want to dive into the shadow, check out psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We have a whole course on the shadow, so we dig into all these topics.
Yeah,
so,
I'll throw that link again,
you.
actually, to your course, although it's going to go away as soon as we close this Zoom. But grab it really quick right now if you want that link. Perhaps the chat will be saved somewhere. Yeah, thanks, everyone, again, and may the force be with you in balance with the light and dark side.
Yes, thank you. Take care.